#6.
Okay, so I believe I centrally muted everybody's line. Our speaker, Margaret Shepard, if I could just ask you to unmute your own line by pressing #6.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes. Great. Thank you. Okay. All right. Let's go ahead and get started here. And all right, I am Margaret. I'm going to hand over control of the slides to you, and then I am going to just do a little introduction, and then we'll go ahead and we'll get started. All right. First of all, welcome everybody. Thanks for attending our webinar on hydrocarbon use in supermarkets. This webinar is being recorded, just so that everybody knows, and that will enable people to log on to the webinar and listen to it at a later time if we're not able to join us today. So because your lines are muted, actually, we are still getting background noise. Margaret, we may have to try that again, but let me finish with the introduction here. Because I am going to mute everybody's line centrally, if you have questions, there are two ways that you can ask them. First, feel free, down in the lower right-hand side, there's a chat function. If you go into the box that should be outlined in blue when you run your cursor over it, to the right of it, there's a send. If you type something in there, for instance, I'm doing right now, I'm typing a test in there. If you type something in there and then hit send, your question will appear in that chat window. The other way that you can ask a question is while Margaret is doing the presentation, I'll be checking the attendee list the whole time in the background. There's down at the lower right-hand side of your screen, there's a little hand. If you click on that little hand, that will alert me to the fact that you have a question. And we have to do it that way just because we do tend to get a lot of background noise. And also with as many people as we often have here on the webinars, it is important that we somehow try to manage the questions that will come in. So, but I'll do that in the background. Let me just, because I see that a lot of people here that just came on and logged on recently, their phone lines aren't muted. So, Margaret, I'm going to centrally mute everybody's lines again, and then you're going to have to press #6 again.
Sound check.
Okay, that sounds good. It's still, I don't know. It still looks like it's not muting everybody's line. But let's go ahead and get started and hope that we don't have the background noise. I would like to introduce Margaret. Can you just advance the slide to your? So there we go. I would like to introduce to everybody my colleague here at the EPA, Margaret Shepard. Margaret is also in the Stratosphere Protection Division, which, of course, as most of you know, that's where the Green Shield Partnership is located. Margaret leads EPA's SNAP program, and she works to evaluate the impacts of alternatives to ozone-depleting substances. And Margaret, I will hand over to you. Go ahead, let's get started. And just for everybody, we will have a Q&A session at the end of Margaret's presentation. But of course, if you do have questions that you feel need to be asked, as we're going along, just for clarity's sake, feel free to raise your hand or type those questions into the chat box. So, okay, Margaret, go ahead.
All right. So I'll talk just a little bit about the Significant New Alternatives Policy Program, the SNAP program. I'll talk a little bit about a recent rule that we issued related to hydrocarbon refrigerants and how that might affect you. I'll mention quite a bit about the major requirements in that rule, and then maybe a few words about some other things to think about if you are considering buying equipment using hydrocarbon refrigerant. So what is the SNAP program, other than kind of a neat acronym, as such things go? Back when the Montreal Protocol was signed back in 1987 to help protect the ozone layer, there was realization that the U.S. was going to have to update the Clean Air Act and include support for that. And one interesting part of that was that Congress realized we shouldn't just think about the chemicals we're phasing out, we should also think about the substitutes for the ozone-depleting substances. And let's make sure that we don't create new environmental and health problems while we're trying to get rid of the old problems with the ozone-depleting substances. And so, part of the Clean Air Act set up the background for the SNAP program. So, say a chemical manufacturer, or maybe an equipment manufacturer, or maybe even someone who wants to use a substitute for an ozone-depleting substance can come into EPA and ask for an evaluation of an alternative to an ozone-depleting substance. That might be an alternative chemical, an alternative refrigerant. It could also be an alternative technology, say thermoelectric refrigeration technology. Now, okay, you probably don't have to deal too much with regulations, hopefully. Why should you care about SNAP? First, it's kind of nice knowing that there's a third party out there who's not making a buck off of this, who is taking a look, trying to make sure that the alternatives are not creating new environmental or health risks. For you personally in the commercial refrigeration industry, first you should be concerned because, well, it's the law. Before someone can introduce a new substitute into commerce, they first have to get review by EPA's SNAP program. In addition, that's also kind of good news, though, because if there's some sort of new refrigerant, new technology that might be available, that also means that the SNAP program is going to know about that, and we're going to try and have as many options out there as possible that you might be able to use as substitutes for ozone-depleting substances. One case in particular that we'll talk about today is using propane as a refrigerant in commercial refrigerators and freezers. So first, I'll give you a bit of an overview of the main requirements of this regulation that EPA issued back in December of last year. Big picture, probably the most important thing to remember from this webinar is that rule clears the way for supermarkets to buy and use new refrigerators and freezers using propane as the refrigerant. So that's kind of the big picture. When I talk about refrigerators and freezers, I'm talking about self-contained units. That can include region freezers or coolers. It could be standalone refrigerators. It does not apply to rack systems. The rule does not apply to vending machines. That's something that we would review separately. That rule also took a look at isobutane and also the refrigerant R441A, and those are also hydrocarbon refrigerants. And we looked at those substances for use in household refrigerators, freezers, and refrigerator freezers. The other thing to remember is that we are talking about new equipment that's designed specifically for these refrigerants. We're not talking about retrofitting existing equipment that was originally designed to use some other refrigerant like R134A or R22. Okay, so some of the major rule requirements. First thing, it becomes effective later this month. And when I say effective, basically that means that the requirements that are in the rule have to be met starting February 21st. So if you actually go and buy this kind of equipment, you need to make sure that it's complying on and after that date. As I mentioned before, we're talking about new equipment, not retrofit. There are two big requirements to keep in mind. One is that EPA's rule requires the refrigerants to be used in equipment that meet the requirements for adjusting flammable refrigerants in the Underwriters Laboratory Standard UL 471 for commercial refrigerators and freezers. So there's just one part of that that's called Supplement SB. And so I think for someone who's actually working in a store, it basically means that when you're considering buying that kind of refrigerant, you want to make sure that you ask, does it comply with UL 471? And if you receive the equipment, does it have some sort of indication that it was tested? The other big requirement is that there is a limit on the charge size, and we're talking about 150 grams specifically for retail food equipment. And that is similar to a requirement that's in the UL 471 standard. And there could be further discussion on that, but I think for most of you, it's probably just good enough to know, okay, that's the size of equipment we're talking about, and usually hydrocarbon refrigerant, you need a charge size about half of that what you need with a halocarbon refrigerant, maybe 40 to 50%. Some other major requirements, just like in the UL 471 standard, the rule requires labeling. In fact, we tried to cut and paste the specific warning statements into the rule. The one thing that's different is that the standard requires that the lettering be 1/8 of an inch high, and EPA's regulation says a quarter of an inch high, or at least a quarter of an inch high. So you should be able to meet both requirements by having the larger font size. Some examples of the kinds of warnings that you will see on labels, things that you should expect to see on this kind of equipment. You'll see warnings saying things like danger, risk of fire or explosion, flammable refrigerant use, or caution, risk of fire or explosion. You'll see these warning labels near the evaporator, particularly if it might be something that a consumer could access. Also, near the engine compartment, there are warnings specifically mentioning things like to be repaired only by trained service personnel, or consult the repair manual owner's guide before attempting to service. In addition, there will be statements on the exterior, again, a statement about danger, risk of fire or explosion, also disposed of properly in accordance with federal or local regulations. And then also near exposed tubing, there would be a warning specifically about the dangers if the refrigerant tubing is ruptured. And then the last major rule requirement is that for the pipes and hoses where the refrigerant flows through and the service port, if there is one, those places need to be marked with red, and that doesn't necessarily mean paint. It could be paint, but it could also be like a plastic sleeve that goes on at the end at the service port. Someone even suggested, could it be red tape? As someone who works for the government, I don't want to be seen as pushing red tape, but that would be something that would be like that. Yes?
I found another list.
You did.
You got a minute?
Yeah, I'm watching.
Sorry, Margaret, that seems to be somebody in the background who doesn't have their phone on mute. I'm not sure how that happens
Resources.
when I have the lines muted.
Okay. Well, hopefully, maybe it'll be such an interesting discussion we all want to listen. But anyway,
Okay.
As far as that red marking, we would expect it to extend at least an inch from the compressor. And the only reason it's probably going to matter to people in the field is that if you ended up maybe cutting off a part of the tubing when you're doing servicing, you might need to replace that red marking.
That was on the other one, right? Anchor door.
So those were the major rule requirements.
Got them on.
Then in addition, some other things that you should be keeping in mind if you are considering purchasing this kind of equipment. Section 608 requirements of the Clean Air Act, that's the requirements for covering refrigerant, that applies to alternatives to ozone-depleting substances, and at least for now, that still includes hydrocarbon refrigerants. It would take a specific regulation to exempt that, the specific requirement, and likewise, no venting allowed. Unless EPA were specifically to find a way to permit it. And then a few recommendations for you to consider. I guess kind of obvious, train service technicians in the proper handling of flammable refrigerants. That might be something to discuss with whoever might sell the equipment, what kind of training they have or technicians that they might be able to provide, or ways that they can help ensure that the equipment is properly serviced. If you are doing your own servicing and you install a service port, we would recommend that the kind of fitting that you put on be different from that's used for non-flammable refrigerants. You could, so for instance, maybe it could be a different diameter, or perhaps the easiest way is just reversing the thread direction so that it's left-handed. And then a final practical thought, it's probably worth checking with the local fire marshal before you buy the equipment. They likely will not have concerns, especially if they find out that each piece of equipment has a similar amount of hydrocarbon to what would be in, say, 3 cans of hairspray, or 3 cans of some cleaner that uses hydrocarbon as the propellant in an aerosol can. But still, since it's something relatively new, it's probably worth at least bringing up the first time. So those are just some additional thoughts, considerations. Okay, and where can I get more information? And one of the questions was, someone was wondering about talking about this more offline. So people are certainly welcome to contact me by email or telephone. My contact information is there at the bottom of this slide. Also, if you are interested in actually seeing a copy of the regulation and also kind of our plain English explanation of what we were thinking about when we were writing it, you can find that at the staff website, www.epa.gov/ozone/snap. And then maybe also useful, more generally, the list of refrigerants for retail food refrigeration is listed there, or you can navigate your way there from the SNAP website also. Okay, so that's my quick brief through the main requirements of the SNAP hydrocarbon rule, and just a little bit more on the SNAP program and how it works. I guess now is a good time to open things up for questions.
Okay, Margaret, thanks very much. I had here quite a lot of questions that came in to me through the chat function, so I'm going to start going through those. If anybody else wants to raise their hand, I can intersperse questions from people who want to ask them themselves with the ones that I got here by chat. Most of the questions that came in by chat came just to me privately, so I'm just going to kind of go through the list and ask them one after the other. So here's a good one. So are you considering an increase in the 150-gram limit to accommodate a multi-deck, similar to what is used in the UK?
Okay. Well, those are both, well, I actually see two parts to that question. First, one thing is that we'll be watching closely. We understand that Underwriters Laboratories, at least for household refrigerators and freezers, I'm not so sure right now. For commercial refrigerators and freezers, I know that UL is considering raising the, they don't have exactly a charge limit. I mentioned this, I was alluding to this before, but in the UL standards, they actually have a test for leakage, and when we thought about that, we said, well, let's take a look at the charge rates, because that's a little easier to define if you're not used to doing testing. Yeah, that's fine when you're UL and you're actually doing the testing, but for the rest of us, it's a little easier to know how much refrigerant is mentioned on the nameplate of the equipment. Would we consider 150 grams or a higher amount? I think if we got additional information, we would consider that. And in fact, I have heard informally from someone who might be considering coming into the SNAP program to look at a system like what they have in the UK, where I guess they have maybe several coolers together, and then they have propane as the primary refrigerant, and then they've got a water loop system, I guess, to help with cooling the equipment down. And I understand that these are very energy efficient systems, so it certainly sounds like something that's worth looking into. So I think if someone wants to pursue that with us, we would certainly be interested. However, right now, the rule doesn't allow for that. We'd have to revise it, and we would need more information to do that.
Okay. Let's see. This is, it is only legal to use these substances in new equipment, right? It is not legal to use propane as a retrofit or service replacement.
That's currently true, yes.
Okay. All right. To be honest, I'm not sure. I have a question here from initials JG, and I'm going to ask it, but to be honest with you, I don't understand the question. You might, Margaret, but if you don't, just feel free to say, and then this person has to just send me more information. It says, do you have to get a new refrigerant certification, such as the ones previously required under, I believe, 40 CFR Part 82? Do you know what that means, Margaret? If not, I can ask this person to either rephrase it or explain.
Yeah, I think I'd want to understand the question better.
Okay. All right, because I don't know what a new refrigerant certification means. So
right.
Okay.
Yes. I can maybe mention just briefly with respect to the SNAP program. I don't think we call the refrigerants certified, but we do have listings of them, and most of them we list as acceptable, and a very bureaucratic term, but it means it's okay to use, and with no restrictions. And then we have another category, which is what we have in this rule for hydrocarbon refrigerants, which is it's acceptable as long as you use it this particular way, as long as you use it with following these conditions. And then there's a third category that's relatively rare, which is unacceptable, which means basically you're not allowed to use it for the particular.
Martin, I got. That's not what the person's talking about. I got additional clarification. He's talking about service tech certification. So it says here, does a mechanic need to be needs to be certified to work with refrigerants? So since these are propanes, does a mechanic have to get an addendum to their certificate?
Let me see. That's actually beyond what I normally do, but my understanding is that's not required for this.
No.
It's just that, yeah.
I can answer that one. Yeah, I mean, no, you don't have to get any kind of official change or addendum to your Section 608 tech certification. We, of course, recommend additional training. I mean, and that's just in your own interest, right? I mean, you know, before you start using any new equipment or new substances that you're not familiar with, you should certainly make sure that you're trained in how to do that. So we recommend additional training, but we don't require more certification.
Right, and also we even thought while working on this rule, should we require training, and we decided that it probably made more sense for the industry to decide on what was the appropriate content of that training, rather than EPA, trying to take a stab at that. Some of the information we've seen from our submitters, one company had a very impressive training program for working with hydrocarbon refrigerants. So I know that there are some people who have put a lot of thought into that out in the industry already.
Okay. We have a question here about systems with 150 grams are very small systems. That's about 6 ounces of refrigerant. Is that correct? I think, Margaret, 150 grams, I think, is kind of the normal charge that you find in supermarket self-contained units, right?
Well, keep in mind also what I said about that with hydrocarbon refrigerant, 150 grams might well be equivalent to a unit that is using R22 that has more like 300 grams. And it's not a particularly large unit, but I understand that, we've seen some examples of units that are pretty much a standard reach-in cooler or a standard ice cream freezer that can be operated. In fact, some of the equipment we've seen can work with less than 100 grams of propane.
Okay, but you shouldn't. I mean, for what this is, for what this has been approved for in commercial refrigeration uses, there shouldn't be a problem to, for equipment manufacturers to manufacture reach-in cooler self-contained units that come in under that 150 grams.
Right, and I understand that other international standards, that it's a little more nuanced there, but they also have some limits, and one of them deals with 150 grams. So it's not that big a change.
Okay. When evaluating a newly proposed refrigerant, does the SNAP program consider the global warming potential of the compound?
That's a good question. Yes, the SNAP program does consider global warming potential as one of the things that we evaluate. So we're not looking at cooling performance. We're looking at what are the environmental and health effects of a substitute. And one of those things is global warming potential.
Okay. There's one here from GG. I think that's certainly off topic today. We're going to have some presentations in the upcoming months on the subject of the question that you posed here. So I'm going to just skip over that one. Okay, do you foresee hydrocarbons ever being used in high-temp systems such as air conditioning?
Do I foresee air conditioning ever being used? I could see that. I mean, I have heard that in other countries there are some companies looking at hydrocarbons for use in air conditioning, and we have actually we've received a submission to our program with information about a hydrocarbon blend for use in room air conditioners, and I understand that UL has recently revised their standard for room air conditioners, so that would be probably the first place where we'll see something like that. And then for larger systems, I think it will come eventually. Not this year, maybe in future years, though.
Okay. There are a whole bunch of questions here about, why you didn't, allow for higher limits and for other uses. And I think it's important to just explain that the SNAP program evaluates uses and conditions that we get applications for. So, especially if you are interested in systems that use larger amounts of hydrocarbons or other types of refrigerants or, other using hydrocarbons for other types of equipment, I think the best way to kind of deal with all of these questions is to say that you should go ahead and contact the SNAP team. We evaluate and find acceptable or unacceptable or acceptable with use conditions only what people submit to us. So there are an awful lot of end uses and an awful lot of different charge sizes where we're certainly willing to look at them and come to a determination on them, but someone has to take the step and submit the information to us. So,
so that's certainly true, Keely. And then I guess adding to that, some of what we considered, we felt a lot more comfortable and a lot more certain that the additional potential risk of flammability was going to be addressed because there is the UL standard, and we would expect in this country that probably most people would have equipment certified to that standard, and so that gave us a lot more comfort. And even if we had a larger limit, the UL standard still would have had its limit, though it is true that those things can change over time as that standards organization gets more information. But the same with us, if we get further information, then we can take a look at it. And then I guess the other thing was that part of our way of looking at the risks is we take a look and we say, well, what happens if, say there's a worst case situation and all of the refrigerant escapes from this piece of equipment rapidly, will we get a situation where it could be explosive or where it could burn? And so So we did an analysis. We said, well, what if we've got this room size? What if we've got this charge size? And it did pass at 150 grams. That wouldn't necessarily be true at much higher charge sizes. It would depend somewhat on what the room size might be that the equipment is in. So it might be possible that there certainly could be situations where a larger charge size would be safe, but that was not supported by the information that we had at the time we were doing the rulemaking, and the standards that we were hoping to rely upon also would not have supported a larger charge size.
And also, I mean, just to back up what Margaret said, it makes the process for the SNAP program to evaluate all of these new types of equipment with larger charge sizes or whatever charge size. If UL already had standards out for them, it certainly makes this SNAP process a lot more certain and a little smoother. So it's kind of right now we're in a situation where obviously you need to have the SNAP approval for the propane and the substance and the equipment, but you also obviously before you install equipment in a store, you also need to have the UL rating on it. So there are kind of two sides to this, so just keep that in mind also. Even if SNAP had approval for everything already through, you would still need to have the UL rating. Let me ask you this one, Margaret. How will imported products be monitored in reference to proper labeling and the like?
Well, that's a great question, and honestly, that's something that we'll probably need to discuss. EPA does work together with representatives at Customs and Border Patrol, and so now that we have a rule that's about to become effective, I guess that's something that we will need to discuss. But ultimately, that particular requirement that the equipment that's used has to have those labels, that will fall upon the end user. So if you're buying imported equipment, that's something that you should make sure is there, and it might need to be part of any contracts or purchase agreements you have, I would suggest.
Yeah. Everybody that purchases this type of equipment, if it's being imported, if you're buying it and it's being imported, make sure that you clarify with the person selling you the equipment ahead of time that it has to meet each one of those use conditions. And if it doesn't, don't hook it up, don't set it up in your store. Okay, here's an interesting one. Can a larger unit be constructed to use multiple refrigeration systems that each contain 150 grams? This would make the overall unit refrigerant charge exceed 150 grams, but each piece of equipment does not exceed the 150-gram threshold.
Okay, that's a great question, actually. And I would say it's each refrigerant loop that has to be no more than 150 grams. So the kind of system that the person was suggesting would indeed comply if you had 3 different refrigerant loops for 3 coolers. That's all fine. Basically, in terms of assessing risks, we're assuming that it's likely to be independent. So each, we wouldn't expect normally that suddenly all 3 loops would release all of the refrigerant all at the same time. So yeah, that's okay.
All right. Has there been any pushback from states or local governments and or unions such as fire departments that they will not approve the use of hydrocarbons in these types of equipment locally?
Oh, that's a good question. I have not heard of any pushback. I am aware that whatever the National Association is for Fire Marshals, is aware that EPA proposed this regulation, and that they put out a publication and mentioned, among other things, that this is something that their members should become aware of, that this might happen at some point. And I also know that Underwriters Laboratories is trying hard to pull in stakeholders, including people like fire marshals and the National Fire Protection Association, the NFPA. So I would say that there might be different levels of understanding or awareness of this, and that I haven't heard anyone yet get really worried about it. But at the same time, I think it is wise to work together with local fire marshals, just so that they know to expect that, and that way, the first responders hopefully will know that that they should keep an eye out, for instance, for equipment that might have the label saying that it contains a flammable refrigerant.
Okay. Here's a good one. So under Section 608, the provisions for refrigerant recovery, are recovery machines approved for hydrocarbon usage?
Well, that is a good question, and I'm not an expert on Section 608, so I don't know. Maybe you can answer that better than I, Keely.
Dave Godwin, are you still on the line? If you are, can you press pound 6? Can you help us out on this one?
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Can you ask the question again?
Okay. So, what about recovery machines for hydrocarbons under Section 608?
Right now, I don't know of a single recovery machine that is designated for hydrocarbons and is certified to 608. That said, I think there was at least one company at the recent ASHRAE Expo in Chicago that was displaying such equipment, and I did talk to a couple others who I think are developing recovery equipment and working on that. So the recovery equipment is needed unless we issue a rule otherwise. And if you are going to service or dispose of the equipment, start asking the people who make that equipment.
Okay. Let's see here. All right. So, are these classified as B1 refrigerants?
These are A3 refrigerants.
A3, okay.
So that means that basically they're low toxicity but high inflammability.
Okay. So when the SNAP approval process considers climate change, do you consider the LCCP or the TIWI when evaluating a new fluid, or just the GWP?
Oh, somebody who's very into these ways. Well, we take a look primarily at the global warming potential, And to the extent that we get information on the LCCP, so LCCP is basically kind of a way of looking more at different parts in the life cycle to see what their impact is on the climate. So you can look at the direct impact if the refrigerant leaks, but you might also want to consider things like how energy efficient is the refrigerant. So I think that's part of what the question is trying to get at. And PWE is basically another way of trying to get at sort of that that broader impact on climate that considers energy usage as well as the direct emissions of the refrigerant. So I don't think we received PWE information for the compounds we looked at this particular time, but we do require that there be energy efficiency information of some sort. And so, PWE or LCCP might be information that we get in general. We didn't get it particularly when we looked at propane and isobutane and R441A. And I do remember we got some energy efficiency information for propane, comparing it. I'm trying to remember if it was to R22 or if it was to R134A or R12. But it did compare to another common halocarbon refrigerant, and it did at least 10% better in energy efficiency. And this is going back several years, so I can't remember the exact number, but it definitely was more energy efficient, and that was something that we consider as kind of an added benefit in addition to the fact that propane has a global warming potential of roughly 3, so much smaller than the numbers you'll see with with any of the HFC refrigerants.
So, and I think that's an important point to make here, Margaret. I'm not sure that was made yet, is, the standard that SNAP looks at, the SNAP program is not looking for perfection in terms of all of the things that they look at. They are looking to make sure that what is being proposed is not worse than what it is replacing. Okay, so
and the other options that are available also. But we try and take a look overall, and there are trade-offs. Great, I've got something that's more flammable, but it's got lower global warming potential, and how do you weigh that? So we tried to consider, what are ways of addressing, that additional flammability risk, so that the overall risk, is going to be, no worse than what's out there already, and hopefully better. And so we think with the use conditions and those additional precautions that really should address whatever additional flammability risks there might be, just because it's a more flammable refrigerant that's being used.
And Dave noted here too that don't forget that there are the Department of Energy requirements for equipment. So equipment has to meet a minimum efficiency level, regardless of which refrigerant is used. So just keep that in mind also. Here's one. During SNAP approval for a refrigerant that is flammable, does EPA test what would happen if a service mechanic added conventional HFC refrigerant over it by mistake?
Does SNAP consider what happens if someone added conventional HFC refrigerant into a piece of equipment that already has, say, a flammable refrigerant in it. That isn't something that we did specifically. We did try and address that at least somewhat originally in our proposed rule, I'm falling into regulatory speak. I'm sorry. Please forgive me. It's something that we considered, and so we have this recommendation that if you do go ahead and put in a service port, try and have something that's different from that for typical non-flammable refrigerants. And like I say, having something with a left-handed thread direction would do that nicely. And then I guess some of the other requirements that are in there, such as the labeling and such as the red marking on the tubing, is meant to give someone, and particularly service techs, try and give them as much warning as possible before they actually, break into the refrigerant loop, that there is a flammable refrigerant in there, and that it's not a non-flammable.
Okay. I'm just going through one more time. I think I got everybody's questions. There are a lot of them, and I jumped around a little bit, so just give me a chance to make sure. I think I got them all. If I missed yours, very quickly, send it in to me again by chat or raise your hand, and we'll let you ask it. But as far as what I received here, I think I covered all of the questions. I'll give everybody one last chance here to ask anything. That was a good Q&A period, Margaret. I don't think we've ever had a situation before where the Q&A lasted longer than the actual presentation did. Usually it's tough to get everybody to speak up with questions.
Well, I'm glad that everyone had such good, thoughtful questions, too.
Yeah, they were good ones. What I am going to do here is I'm going to just very quickly post an email address. If you would like to have the slides emailed to you, please send if you could do me a favor and send a quick email. I'm going to type it in here. If you would send a quick email to this person and just request the slides. Now, of course, cut and paste doesn't work. Okay, here, let me type it in. Sorry about the delay here.